The greatest warriors of the Crusades were not who you think. We know the legends of European knights, but history was equally shaped by their brilliant and relentless opponents, the Saracen warriors. By the end of this journey, you will know the stories of 30 legendary commanders whose strategies and courage decided the fate of kingdoms and faiths. How did an undefeated general simply vanish from command, and what secret offer could have returned Jerusalem without a single sword being drawn? These are the mysteries we will solve. We are moving past the simplified tales of holy war to meet the real people behind the legends, from the sultan who earned his enemies' respect to the shadowy master who ruled from a mountain fortress. Their world was one of shocking betrayals, impossible gambles, and a clash of civilizations that forged the medieval world. What does true strength look like when your homeland is on the line? To understand the scale of the Saracen military genius, you must start at the very beginning with a man whose very name became a weapon. Khalid ibn al-Walid was born into a powerful clan of the Quraysh tribe in Mecca, a natural leader and a formidable cavalryman long before the message of Islam reached his ears. He fought against the early Muslims at the Battle of Uhud, a clash where his tactical mind first shone through. But in a twist that would change history, he later embraced the faith he once opposed, offering his legendary skills to the Prophet Muhammad. This conversion was not just spiritual, it was a seismic shift in military power. Khalid's rise was immediate and spectacular. He became the sharp edge of the Rashidun Caliphate's expansion, leading armies across the Arabian Peninsula and into the heart of the Byzantine and Persian empires. His true masterpiece, however, was the Battle of Yarmouk in 636. Facing a massive Byzantine force intent on crushing the young Muslim state, Khalid did not merely meet them head-on. He orchestrated a 6-day dance of feints, maneuvers, and relentless pressure. He used the desert heat and the terrain itself as allies, stretching the Byzantine lines thin before launching devastating cavalry charges at their weakest points. The victory was total, and it permanently secured Syria for Islam. For such service, he earned the title Sayfullah, the Sword of Allah. This was not a boast, but a recognition from the Caliph Umar himself, signifying that Khalid was an instrument of divine will, a commander whose success seemed blessed. His leadership was a terrifying blend of innovation and intimidation. He moved his armies with shocking speed, often appearing where the enemy least expected. He mastered psychological warfare, spreading rumors to demoralize foes before a single arrow was fired. In over 100 battles, major and minor, he remained undefeated, a record that places him among the greatest generals of all time. And yet his story ends not on a battlefield but in quiet obscurity. Shortly after his greatest triumph, Caliph Umar dismissed Khalid from supreme command. The reasons are a historical puzzle whispered about for centuries. Some say it was to remind the army that victory came from God, not from any one man. Others suggest political concerns over his growing fame. Khalid accepted this demotion without public complaint, serving as a simple soldier until his death from illness in 642. He was buried in humble clothes, his grave unmarked for a time. How does a figure of such colossal stature simply fade from command? The mystery of his dismissal only deepens the legend of the Sword of Allah, a warrior who carved an empire and then vanished into history, his final chapter as subdued as his battles were thunderous. The quiet end of the Sword of Allah is a mystery that cuts to the heart of power itself. Why would a caliph remove his most successful, undefeated general at the peak of his influence? The answer is not written in one clear record, but in layers of conflicting accounts and whispered theories that historians still debate. The most prominent reason given by Caliph Umar himself and echoed in many early chronicles was a matter of principle. Umar feared that the Muslim armies and perhaps the people were beginning to attribute their miraculous victories to the military genius of Khalid ibn al-Walid alone. To correct this, to reaffirm that every triumph came by the will of God, Yuma made the dramatic decision to recall the legendary commander. It was a powerful theological statement, a reminder that no mortal, no matter how gifted, was the true source of their success. This theory paints the dismissal as a profound act of faith, a sacrifice of strategic advantage for spiritual clarity. Yet other sources suggest more worldly concerns swirled beneath the surface. Khalid was known for his independence, for making strategic decisions without always seeking prior approval from Medina. To a caliph building a centralized state based on law and consultation, such autonomy could be seen as dangerously unpredictable. There were also murmurs about Khalid's lifestyle, about his distribution of war spoils, which some considered overly generous to his loyal troops or even to himself. These actions, while perhaps typical for a beloved commander, could be framed as a challenge to the caliph's authority and the new state's strict economic policies. Then there is the ever-present shadow of politics. Khalid was from the powerful Maxim clan, traditional rivals of Yuma's own Adi clan. While personal animosity is rarely cited directly, the underlying tribal dynamics of early Islamic society cannot be ignored. Removing a figure of such immense popularity from a rival faction could be seen as a move to consolidate power and prevent the rise of a military dynasty. So which theory holds true? It is likely all of them intertwined. Yuma's primary motive may indeed have been the pious one he stated, but the political and administrative tensions made the difficult decision easier to justify and execute. The impact was immediate, though not catastrophic. Khalid's successor, Abu Ubaidah, was a competent and pious commander who continued the campaign successfully. Yet something undeniably shifted. The lightning-fast, audacious maneuvers that defined Khalid's style gave way to a more cautious, systematic approach. Some historians argue that without his dismissal, the expansion into Persia and Anatolia might have progressed even faster, his relentless momentum carrying the armies further. But perhaps Yuma understood that empires are not built by swords alone, but by institutions. He traded the unpredictable brilliance of a single star for the steadier, collective light of a system that could endure. Khalid accepted his demotion with a grace that is as legendary as his battles, reportedly saying he fought for God, not for Yuma. He faded into the ranks, a ghost of his former command, leaving us to wonder what other conquests were lost when the sword of Allah was quietly sheathed. If Khalid's story is one of brilliant conquest, the legend of Saladin is one of calculated restoration. He emerged not from the Arabian deserts, but from the mountainous lands of Kurdistan, a man named Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub. His path to power was not through open rebellion, but through loyal service within the turbulent Zengid dynasty, first in Syria and then in the politically treacherous landscape of Egypt. There, as a vizier, he quietly consolidated power, not with dramatic coups, but with careful alliances and administrative savvy. When his Zengid overlord died, Saladin stepped into the vacuum, founding his own Ayyubid dynasty. His true goal, however, lay to the north. The Crusader kingdom of Jerusalem, established nearly a century earlier, was a permanent wound in the heart of the Muslim world, and it was fractured by internal squabbles. Saladin spent over a decade in a relentless diplomatic and military campaign, weaving together the rival Muslim emirates of Syria, Mesopotamia, and Egypt into a single, unified front. For the first time in generations, the Crusaders faced a coordinated Islamic power that surrounded them. This set the stage for a climatic confrontation in the scorching summer of 1187. The Crusader army, against wiser counsel, marched out to relieve a besieged fortress, choosing a desperate trek across a waterless plateau. Saladin saw his moment. His forces shadowed the Crusaders, harassing them with arrows and setting fire to the dry grass, choking them with smoke and thirst. He herded them, exhausted and dehydrated, toward the twin hills known as the Horns of Hattin. There he sprung his trap, encircling the Christian host and cutting off their final retreat to the Sea of Galilee. The Battle of Hattin was not merely a defeat, it was an annihilation. The Crusader army was destroyed, and most significantly, the sacred relic of the true cross was captured. With the military backbone of the kingdom shattered, Saladin swept through the Crusader cities. In October of that same year, he achieved his life's ambition, recapturing Jerusalem for Islam. Yet his entry into the Holy City defined his legacy as much as his victory. Unlike the bloody sack that had accompanied the First Crusade, Saladin took the city with remarkable restraint. He allowed safe passage for most Christian inhabitants who could pay a modest ransom, and he protected holy sites. He even provided funds from his own treasury for those too poor to pay. When his own soldiers questioned this mercy, he replied that war was for fighting men, not for civilians and the defenseless. This chivalry became his trademark. After Hattin, he personally offered a cup of iced water to the defeated King Guy of Lusignan, a gesture symbolizing that his quarrel was not with a man suffering. He paid physicians to treat wounded enemy soldiers. These acts were strategic, fostering an image of a magnanimous and just ruler, but they were also rooted in a personal code of honor that baffled and impressed his European adversaries. It was this reputation that set the stage for his most famous personal rivalry, a clash of ideals with a warrior king who would arrive by sea, Richard the Lionheart. Their conflict would become the stuff of epic poetry, a duel between two titans who, in a strange twist of history, seemed to respect each other more than they did their own allies. The chivalry Saladin showed at Jerusalem set a standard, but it would be tested by a king who matched his ambition with sheer martial fury. Richard I of England, known as the Lionheart, arrived in the Holy Land in 1191, a whirlwind of energy and military genius. He found the Third Crusade bogged down in a grueling 2-year siege of the port city of Acre. Richard's arrival broke the deadlock. He combined relentless assaults with formidable siege engines, forcing the city's surrender. But the aftermath was grim. Disputes over terms and ransom payments led Richard to order the execution of nearly 3,000 Muslim prisoners, a brutal act that stands in stark contrast to Saladin's earlier mercy and shattered any early illusions of a courteous war. This was the harsh reality beneath the later legends. The campaign then became a deadly southward march along the coast, with Richard aiming for Jaffa as a stepping stone to Jerusalem. Saladin, ever the master of maneuver, shadowed the Crusader army, launching constant hit-and-run attacks with his light cavalry. His goal was not a single grand battle, but to stretch the Crusader column thin, to pick away at its edges, to exhaust and demoralize the invaders with 1,000 small cuts under the punishing sun. Richard, however, was a master of discipline. He kept his forces in a tight, defensive formation, his armored infantry forming a mobile fortress on the march, with crossbowmen protecting the flanks. The climax of this tactical duel came near the forest of Arsuf. For days, Saladin's horsemen swarmed the Crusaders, raining arrows and darting in to charge. Richard held his knights, his most powerful weapon, in check, forbidding a countercharge despite mounting casualties and provocation. He waited for the perfect moment when the Muslim cavalry had overextended and their discipline wavered. Then he unleashed the heavy knights in a coordinated, thunderous charge that shattered Saladin's left flank and turned the battle. It was a victory for Richard's iron control over Saladin's fluid harassment. Yet for all the bloodshed, a strange personal respect grew between the two commanders. They never met face to face, but they communicated through envoys. Stories abound of Saladin sending gifts of fruit and snow to cool Richard's fever during an illness, and of Richard famously offering his sister in marriage to Saladin's brother to unite their families and rule Jerusalem jointly, an offer politely refused but legendary for its audacity. Most telling is the account that when Richard was wounded, Saladin offered the services of his own personal physician. This was not just politics, it was a recognition of a worthy adversary, a knight across the field. After years of marching, skirmishing, and 2 failed marches on Jerusalem itself, both men were exhausted. Richard knew he could not hold the city even if he took it, and Saladin could not dislodge the Crusaders from the coast. In September 1192, they agreed to the Treaty of Ramla, a pragmatic stalemate. Jerusalem remained under Muslim control, but the city's gates were open to unarmed Christian pilgrims. The Crusader kingdom was reduced to a thin coastal strip, but it survived. This conflict, more than any other, transformed the Crusades from a holy war into a personal saga. In the centuries that followed, European minstrels and Arab chroniclers alike polished the story, turning Saladin into the model of noble Saracen chivalry and Richard into the ultimate warrior king. Their rivalry, a blend of brutal warfare and startling courtesy, created the romantic template for how we still imagine the Age of Crusades, a clash where the line between enemy and honorable foe could sometimes blur. But the age of chivalrous rivalries was ending, replaced by a far more ruthless kind of warrior. Where Saladin was a unifier who showed mercy, his ultimate successor was a product of the system Saladin helped create, a man forged in slavery and blood. He was al-Malik al-Zahir Rukn al-Din Baibars al-Bundakdari, known to history simply as Baibars. His story begins not in a palace but on the windswept steppes of Central Asia. As a young Kipchak Turk, he was captured and sold into slavery, ending up in the markets of Damascus. For most, this was a life of servitude. For Baibars, it was an entry into the elite military brotherhood of the Mamluks, slave soldiers who were the true power behind the thrones of Egypt and Syria. His immense physical presence, marked by a distinctive white cataract in one eye, and his natural talent for command quickly set him apart. His rise, however, was cemented not against Crusaders, but against a far more terrifying foe. In 1260, a massive Mongol army under the general Kitbuka swept into Syria, destroying everything in its path. The Muslim world seemed on the brink of annihilation. At the pivotal battle of Ain Jalut in Palestine, it was Baibars, then a senior commander, who played the decisive role. He used a classic steppe tactic against the masters of steppe warfare, feigning a retreat to lure the Mongol cavalry into a narrow valley where the main Mamluk force lay in ambush. The Mongols were crushed, their advance permanently halted. Ain Jalut was more than a victory, it was a salvation, and it proved the Mamluks were now the paramount power in the region. Soon after, Baibars orchestrated the assassination of the reigning sultan and seized the throne for himself. He was no dynastic heir, he was a self-made king of the battlefield. As sultan, Baibars transformed the Mamluk institution into a terrifyingly efficient military machine. He built a professional, standing army loyal directly to him, organized into precise regiments. He established a sophisticated network of swift horse relay couriers, allowing information and orders to travel from Cairo to Damascus in just 4 days. He fortified cities, built new warships for the Nile and the Mediterranean, and turned his realm into a fortress state. His war against the Crusader remnants was not a romantic quest, it was a systematic extermination. He understood that the coastal castles were the backbone of their power, and he set out to dismantle them one by one. His masterpiece was the reduction of the Crac des Chevaliers, the greatest Crusader castle ever built, a mountain fortress considered impregnable. In 1271, Baibars surrounded it. He did not just rely on siege engines, he employed a campaign of psychological warfare. His troops intercepted relief messages and forged a letter, supposedly from the Grand Master of the Knights Hospitaller inside, ordering the garrison to surrender. The demoralized defenders, believing they had been abandoned, capitulated. It was a triumph of cunning over stone. He then turned to the great city of Antioch, the ancient capital of a Crusader principality. Using massive trebuchets to batter its walls for weeks, he took the city by storm in 1268. The aftermath was brutal, the population enslaved or killed, a deliberate act of terror meant to shatter the morale of every remaining Latin settlement. Baibars was a master of such dark arts, using espionage, assassination of rival leaders, and calculated brutality to weaken his enemies long before his armies arrived. By the time of his death in 1277, the Crusader presence in the Levant had been reduced to a few fortified coastal cities, clinging desperately to the shore. Baibars did not just defeat his enemies, he engineered a new political reality, a Mamluk empire ruled by the sword, where a former slave could become the most feared sultan in the Muslim world, and where the fate of kingdoms was decided not by noble gestures but by relentless, uncompromising strategy. The relentless statecraft of Baibars was built upon a foundation laid decades earlier by a very different kind of ruler. Before Saladin could dream of uniting Islam, and long before the Mamluks saved it from the Mongols, a quiet, intensely pious prince was patiently stitching together the fractured fabric of Muslim Syria. His name was Nur ad-Din Muhammad Zengi, and his ambition was not merely to defeat the Crusaders, but to outlast them by creating a society strong enough to endure. He inherited a fragment of his father's territory, the city of Aleppo, at a time when the Muslim world was a patchwork of rival emirs more concerned with fighting each other than the foreign invaders on their coast. Nur ad-Din saw this disunity as the root of their weakness. His life's work became a dual campaign, one military and one profoundly spiritual, to forge a single, righteous front. He understood that to win a holy war, he first had to build a holy state. His piety was not for show, it was the core of his strategy. He lived with austere simplicity, dressing in coarse wool and spending his personal wealth not on palaces but on public works. He constructed grand madrasas, religious schools, to train a new generation of scholars and judges loyal to his vision. He funded hospitals called Baibars that offered free care to all, Muslim and Christian alike, seeing public welfare as a religious duty. This building campaign was as strategic as any fortification. It won him the hearts of his people and created a stable, well-administered realm from which to launch his wars. His military prowess matched his devotion. His greatest victory came at the Battle of Inab in 1149. The Crusader prince of Antioch, Raymond of Poitiers, had grown overconfident, leading a force into Nur ad-Din's territory. Nur ad-Din, with a smaller army, used superior reconnaissance and terrain to his advantage, encircling the Crusaders in a narrow pass. The result was a devastating rout. Prince Raymond was killed, and his skull was reportedly sent as a grim trophy to the Caliph in Baghdad. The victory shattered Crusader power in northern Syria and announced Nur ad-Din as the preeminent Muslim leader of his generation. Yet for all his successes on the battlefield, his most lasting victory was one of ideology. He tirelessly promoted the concept of a unified jihad, using preachers and poets to turn local conflicts into a sacred struggle for all Muslims. He patiently absorbed Damascus into his realm through diplomacy and pressure, finally uniting the two great cities of Syria under one banner. This was the essential platform, the consolidated power base that made everything after possible. When he died in 1174, he left behind a strong, coherent, and motivated kingdom, a coiled spring. He had no son capable of holding this inheritance together, and it was into this vacuum that his former lieutenant in Egypt, Saladin, would step. Saladin did not create the unity he wielded at Hattin. He inherited its blueprint from Nur ad-Din. The Sultan who retook Jerusalem stood upon the shoulders of the prince who first made such a triumph conceivable, a ruler who proved that true strength is built not just with swords, but with schools, hospitals, and an unshakable idea. The patient statecraft of Nur ad-Din was a legacy inherited from a father who ruled with an iron fist. Imad ad-Din Zengi was a storm that broke over the fractured Muslim world, a warlord of terrifying ambition and ferocity. From his twin power bases of Mosul in Iraq and Aleppo in Syria, He gazed upon the Crusader states not as permanent neighbors but as intruders to be erased. His life was a relentless campaign of conquest, first against rival Muslim princes to consolidate his own territory, and then with a unified force against the Latins. He understood that the Crusaders' greatest weakness was their own division, and he exploited it with a predator's patience. His tactics were a brutal pragmatism, blending sudden, overwhelming military strikes with shrewd, often temporary, alliances with other Muslim rulers or even with Crusader lords against their own rivals. He was feared, not loved, a man known for his volcanic temper and harsh justice, but this very fear made him effective. He commanded obedience through strength, forging the disparate factions of northern Syria and the Jazira into a weapon pointed squarely at the heart of Outremer. His moment of destiny arrived in the winter of 1144, targeting the county of Edessa. This was the weakest of the Crusader states, isolated from its allies and ruled by a count who was absent, leaving the city poorly defended. Zengi moved with stunning speed, surrounding the city and launching a furious assault with siege towers and miners to undermine the walls. The defenders, desperate and leaderless, could not hold. On December 24th, his troops breached the defenses. The fall of Edessa sent a seismic shock through both worlds. For the Crusaders, it was a catastrophe, the first major permanent loss of territory since their arrival. For the Muslim world, it was a revelation, a dazzling proof that these seemingly invincible Franks could be defeated and their lands taken back. The victory electrified the Islamic East, transforming Zengi from a regional strongman into a hero of the faith, a mujahid. His success was so profound it triggered a massive pan-European response, the Second Crusade, a 2-year campaign that ultimately failed to recapture the city. Zengi himself did not live to see this reaction, assassinated by a slave in 1146, but his legacy was indelible. He proved the Crusader states were not immortal. He shifted the momentum from defense to offense, and he founded the Zengid dynasty, a line that would produce his far more statesmanlike son, Nur ad-Din. Imad ad-Din Zengi was the brutal catalyst, the hammer that first cracked the Frankish armor, setting in motion a chain of resistance that would, decades later, culminate at the horns of Hattin. Usama ibn Munki offers a view from inside the castle walls. While sultans plotted grand strategy, he lived the daily reality of the frontier, a Syrian prince, poet, and warrior who fought for nearly 70 years. His homeland was the formidable fortress of Shazar, perched on a cliff above the Orontes River, a borderland kingdom caught between the ambitions of Damascus, Aleppo, and the encroaching Crusader states. Usama did not just hear about the Franks, he fought them, dined with them, and observed them with the sharp, often bemused eye of a cultured aristocrat. His life was a tapestry of constant warfare and fragile truces, serving a rotating caste of Muslim overlords from the Zengids of Aleppo to the court of Saladin himself, all while his own family dynasty clung to its rocky perch. This long career on the front lines gave him a perspective no grand chronicler could match. He saw the Franks not as a monolithic enemy, but as a strange and fascinating people with baffling customs. Late in his long life, he poured these observations into a remarkable memoir, the Book of Contemplation. It is not a dry history, but a collection of personal anecdotes, witty stories, and vivid snapshots that bring the 12th century to life with startling humanity. He writes of cultural misunderstandings that border on comedy, like the time a newly arrived Frankish knight, in a gesture of clumsy goodwill, insisted that Usama and his companions pray facing east in a church that had been converted from a mosque, not understanding they were already facing the correct direction for Muslim prayer. He recounts tales of shocking Frankish medical practices with horror mixed with curiosity, describing a European doctor who amputated a knight's infected leg with an axe, killing him, and another who prescribed a diet of garlic and vinegar to a sick woman until she died. To Usama, trained in the more systematic Greco-Arabic medical tradition, this was sheer butchery. yet he also tells stories of genuine respect and unexpected friendship. He writes warmly of a Frankish lord who protected him during a tense encounter, and he details the complex codes of knightly honor, the very codes that would later define the legends of Saladin and Richard. He is fascinated by their judicial duels where guilt or innocence was decided by combat, a concept utterly foreign to Islamic law. Through his eyes, the Crusaders become fully human, neither demons nor saints, but neighbors who are sometimes brutal, sometimes generous, and always profoundly alien. His legacy is therefore unique. Usama ibn Monkey, the warrior, is remembered not for a single great victory, but for wielding a pen with the same skill as his sword. He gave us a portrait of an era in all its messy, contradictory detail, a reminder that history is lived by people, not just by armies on a map. The intimate observations of Usama show a world already in motion, but that motion began with an earthquake decades before he was born. While the Crusader state seemed permanent in the 12th century, their very existence was the result of a single, catastrophic defeat that shattered an empire. The man who delivered that blow was Alp Arslan, the Lion Sultan of the great Seljuk Empire. He was a conqueror in the classic steppe tradition, a master of mounted warfare whose reign focused on consolidating the vast, sprawling territories his predecessors had won. His gaze was fixed not on the distant Mediterranean coast, but on the ancient heart of Christian power to his west, the Byzantine Empire. For centuries, this empire had been the bulwark between the Islamic East and Europe, but by the 11th century, it was a shadow of its former self, riven by internal coups and military neglect. Its new emperor, Romanos IV Diogenes, was a capable soldier determined to reverse this decline. He assembled a massive, diverse army, perhaps the largest Byzantine force in generations, and marched east in the spring of 1071. His goal was to crush the Seljuk menace once and for all and secure the empire's Anatolian heartland. Alp Arslan, however, was waiting. He had been campaigning in Syria but raced north to meet the threat, gathering a smaller but supremely mobile force of Turkish horse archers and loyal allied contingents. The two armies met near the fortress of Manzikert in what is now eastern Turkey. Romanos, confident in his numbers, arrayed his troops in a deep, classic formation. Alp Arslan's strategy was one of fluid deception. He deployed his cavalry in a wide, crescent-shaped line and began the battle with a relentless hail of arrows from a distance, refusing to close for direct combat. As the day wore on, groups of Seljuk horsemen would surge forward, unleash their arrows, and then wheel away as if in panic, a classic feigned retreat. The disciplined Byzantine center held firm, but on the wings the temptation proved too great. A portion of the right wing, likely including unreliable mercenary troops, broke ranks to pursue what they thought was a fleeing enemy. It was a trap. The Seljuk cavalry led them into a carefully prepared killing zone, then turned and enveloped them. At the same moment, a commander on the Byzantine left wing, either through treachery or misunderstanding, ordered a full retreat, believing the battle was lost. The Byzantine army unraveled. Romanos and his elite guard fought desperately but were surrounded and overwhelmed. The emperor himself was captured and brought before the victorious sultan. The immediate aftermath was almost cinematic in its drama. Alp Arslan did not humiliate his royal prisoner. He treated him with respect, asking him what he would have done if their positions were reversed. When Romanos admitted he would have had him executed or paraded in disgrace, Alp Arslan simply smiled and said he would show more mercy. He demanded a modest ransom, a promise of annual tribute, and a marriage alliance, then released the emperor. It was a magnanimous gesture, but its political effect was devastating. Romanos returned to Constantinople to find he had been deposed in his absence. He was blinded and died soon after, and the treaty was renounced. The Byzantine civil war that followed meant there was no central authority to resist what came next. The true consequence of Manzikert was not the battle itself, but the door it kicked open. With the Byzantine military and government in collapse, the pastoral Turkish tribes following the Seljuk armies did not just raid Anatolia, they settled it. They moved their families and flocks onto the plateau, establishing permanent roots. Within a generation, Anatolia, the breadbasket and recruiting ground of the Roman Empire for a millennium, was transforming into a new homeland, the future heart of Turkey. This seismic shift sent panic through Christendom. The great Eastern Empire, the shield of Europe, had been broken. Pilgrim routes to Jerusalem were now threatened by this new Turkish power. The desperate appeals from Constantinople for mercenaries would eventually reach the ears of Pope Urban II, who saw in this crisis a grander opportunity. In 1095, he would call for a holy war to aid the Eastern Christians and reclaim the Holy Land, setting in motion the very Crusades that Alp Arslan, by shattering one world, had unintentionally summoned into being. The door Alp Arslan opened at Manzikert was held wide by his son and successor. Malik Shah I inherited an empire on the march, and he proved to be a ruler who understood that conquests must be cemented with civilization. His nearly 20-year reign marked the dazzling zenith of the great Seljuk Empire, a period where the sword and the pen were wielded with equal mastery. While a gifted administrator and patron, he remained at his core a warrior king who personally led campaigns to secure his frontiers and expand his influence. He pushed Seljuk power deeper into Anatolia, consolidating the Turkish hold after his father's victory, and he turned his armies eastward to subdue rebellious provinces in Transoxiana. But his true genius lay in delegation. He commanded a cotta of brilliant and fiercely loyal generals who acted as extensions of his will. The most significant of these was Atsiz ibn Uwak, a Turkoman commander of ruthless ambition. Malik Shah dispatched Atsiz to subdue Syria and Palestine, regions then under the shaky control of the Shia Fatimid Caliphate of Egypt. Atsiz carved a path of conquest down the Mediterranean coast. Then, in 1073, he achieved a goal that would echo through history. He captured the holy city of Jerusalem from the Fatimids. This was not the epic siege of later legends, but a stark military takeover. For the first time, the city revered by three faiths was under Sunni Turkish rule, a fact that would fundamentally alter the religious landscape and become a primary catalyst for the Crusades 2 decades later. Malik Shah's relationship with the Franks who later arrived was indirect but profound. He died just as the First Crusade was being preached in Europe, so he never faced them directly. Yet, the empire he left behind was the very power the Crusaders would initially confront, and the political fragmentation that followed his death made their early successes possible. His true legacy was built in partnership with one of history's greatest statesmen, his Persian vizier Nizam al-Mulk. This partnership defined an era. Nizam al-Mulk was the architect of the Seljuk administrative system, creating a centralized bureaucracy that could govern an empire stretching from Central Asia to the Aegean Sea. He founded the famous Nizamiya madrasas in major cities like Baghdad, institutions of higher learning that standardized Islamic education and produced generations of scholars, judges, and officials loyal to the Seljuk state. Under their joint rule, cities like Isfahan were transformed with magnificent mosques, libraries, and observatories. The poet and mathematician Omar Khayyam flourished at Malik Shah's court, refining the solar calendar. This was the Golden Age, a conscious fusion of Turkish military might with Persian administrative genius and Arab scholarly tradition. But empires built around singular figures carry a fatal weakness. When Malik Shah died suddenly in 1092, possibly from poisoning, he left no clear succession plan. The result was a devastating civil war among his sons and brothers, a conflict that tore the unified Seljuk realm into competing sultanates based in Iraq, Syria, and Anatolia. This fragmentation created a power vacuum in the very lands the Crusaders would soon invade. The princes who should have united against the foreign invasion were too busy fighting each other. The magnificent system built by Malik Shah and Nizam al-Mulk shattered, leaving a puzzle of rival states for both Crusader knights and future Muslim unifiers like Zengi and Nur ad-Din to navigate. His reign was the high watermark, a glimpse of a unified Islamic East that, once lost, would take a century of warfare to rebuild. The golden age of Malik Shah was built by men of ruthless action. Aziz ibn Uwaq was one such man, a Turkoman warlord whose ambition burned as hot as the Syrian sun. As a commander for the great Seljuk Sultan, his orders were clear: to bring the rebellious lands of Syria and Palestine to heel, wresting them from the Shia Fatimid Caliphate based in Cairo. Aziz was the perfect instrument for this task, a master of swift, brutal cavalry warfare who understood the politics of fear. He swept down from the north in a series of relentless campaigns, his armies a storm of dust and arrows. City after city fell to his onslaught, from Damascus to the coastal towns. Then, in the year 1073, he turned his gaze toward the ultimate prize, the holy city of Jerusalem. The Fatimid garrison was weak, the city's defenses neglected. Aziz did not need a protracted siege, he took it by assault. The capture itself was a military event, but its symbolism was tectonic. For the first time, Jerusalem, the spiritual heart of so much conflict, passed from Shia to Sunni control, and into the hands of the rising Turkish power that had so recently shattered the Byzantines at Manzikert. This shift in the holy city's ownership would become a central grievance, a rallying cry that echoed all the way to the pulpits of Europe. But Aziz was not a pious administrator, he was a conqueror. His rule over Jerusalem and Palestine was notoriously harsh. He imposed crushing taxes on the population, both Muslim and Christian, and his troops were known for their brutality. He was a man ruling by the sword alone, and that very ambition soon turned against his masters. Emboldened by his successes and controlling a rich territory, Aziz decided he could be more than a servant. He rebelled against the Seljuk overlords who had given him his command, striking his own coins and declaring his independence. This was the peril of relying on such formidable frontier lords. Their strength could always be turned inward. The Seljuk response was inevitable and severe. Aziz found himself besieged in his own stronghold, the fortress of al-Zarqa in Jordan, by a loyalist Seljuk army in 1079. The end was as dramatic and brutal as his life. After a fierce resistance, the fortress fell. Captured, Aziz faced a punishment designed to be a terrifying lesson. Historical accounts state he was flayed alive, his skin peeled from his body as a grim testament to the price of treason. His story is a stark capsule of the era. He was not a unifying hero like Saladin, but a volatile, ambitious emir, a creature of the frontier who carved out a domain through sheer force and horrific violence. He captured Jerusalem, altering the religious map forever, yet he left behind only a legacy of fear and instability. Men like Aziz ibn Uwaq created the very chaos, the patchwork of warring lords and shifting allegiances, that the Knights of the First Crusade would march into just 16 years later, a land ripe for the taking because it could not unite. While Aziz's rebellion ended in a skin of treachery, the city he once took, Damascus, would soon fall under the control of a far more calculating survivor. Zahir ad-Din Tutakin began not as a king but as a guardian. He was a Turkish military slave, a Mamluk who rose to become the trusted Ayyubid or regent for the young Seljuk Prince Dukak who ruled Damascus after the great empire fractured. An Ayyubid's duty was to protect the prince and guide the realm, but in this era of crumbling central authority, the strongest regents often became the real power. Tutakin was a master of this subtle art. He served Dukak loyally, commanding his armies and managing the state, all while weaving a web of alliances and loyalties within the military and the city's elite. When Dukak died in 1104, the transition of power was seamless. Tutakin simply continued to rule, first in the name of Dukak's infant son, and then, as that boy also passed away, he openly founded his own dynasty, the Baibars. There was no dramatic coup, just the quiet, inevitable assumption of control by the man who had been pulling the strings all along. His long reign, lasting nearly 30 years, was a masterclass in pragmatic statecraft. Damascus was an island in a sea of sharks. To the west lay the aggressive Crusader kingdom of Jerusalem under its formidable king, Baldwin I. To the north were rival Turkish princes in Aleppo and Mosul, often more hostile than the Franks. To the east, in the mountain fortresses, lurked the mysterious order of assassins whose daggers could topple any ruler. Tutakin's strategy was one of fluid realism. He understood that Damascus could not afford a war on all fronts, so he chose his battles with cold precision. He fought the Crusaders when he had to, clashing repeatedly with King Baldwin in a series of indecisive but bloody battles that kept the Franks from the city's gates. Yet, when exhaustion set in or when a greater threat emerged from a Muslim rival, Tutakin did the unthinkable in the rhetoric of holy war. He signed truces with Jerusalem. These were not acts of friendship, but survival pacts allowing Damascus to trade, breathe, and regroup. He even engaged in a form of cynical cooperation, at times agreeing to stay neutral while the Crusaders attacked his Muslim enemies elsewhere, a calculation that prioritized his city's independence above a unified jihad. This complex dance extended to the assassins. He fought them when they threatened his rule, but also reportedly reached understandings with them, another testament to his flexible, unsentimental approach to power. His legacy was a durable one. The Bairid dynasty he founded held Damascus for over 50 years, maintaining it as a wealthy, independent Muslim power in the heart of Syria. Tutakin proved that in the chessboard of the Crusader era, the most successful pieces were not always the knights charging forward, but the kings who knew when to move sideways, to wait, and to make a temporary peace in order to secure a permanent throne. Damascus under Tutakin survived by cunning, but the fate of its northern neighbor would be decided by a far more brutal hand. Najm ad-Din Ilghazi, the Artukid ruler of Mardin, was a warlord of pure, unrefined ferocity. His life was a relentless scramble for power in the chaotic world left after Malik Shah's death, fighting as a mercenary commander for one Seljuk prince after another, switching allegiances as it suited his ambition. He was a survivor of countless battles and political betrayals, a man who finally carved out his own independent territory based around the formidable fortress of Mardin, a rocky sentinel overlooking the plains of northern Mesopotamia. By 1119, his gaze fixed on a rich and tempting prize, the Crusader Principality of Antioch. Its ruler, Roger of Salerno, was young, confident, and perhaps overeager for glory. Roger marched his army east, seeking to punish Muslim raids and perhaps capture new territory. He chose to camp in a wooded valley near Sarmada, a place the Franks would later name the Ager Sanguinis, the Field of Blood. Ilghazi, with a larger force drawn from his Artukid troops and allied Turkoman tribesmen, saw his chance. He knew the terrain intimately. While Roger's knights rested in their camp, Ilghazi's scouts watched every move. In the early morning of June 28th, he sprung his trap. His forces emerged from the surrounding hills and forests, completely surrounding the Crusader position. The battle was not a clash of lines, but a slaughter. The Frankish cavalry, their greatest strength, had no room to charge. They were compressed into a chaotic, desperate mass, cut down by arrows and overwhelmed by successive waves of Turkish horsemen who charged, retreated, and charged again. Roger of Salerno fought to the last, but he was killed and his army was annihilated. Of perhaps 3,000 Frankish soldiers, only a handful escaped. The aftermath was a scene of calculated horror. Ilghazi ordered the bodies of the fallen knights beheaded. Chroniclers write that he had the heads collected and sent as grim trophies to neighboring Muslim rulers, a stark announcement of his victory. The scale of the catastrophe sent paralyzing terror through every Crusader settlement. Antioch itself, now virtually defenseless, braced for a siege that never quite came. Ilghazi, true to his nature as a raider more than a conqueror of great cities, chose to plunder the countryside instead of pressing his advantage, a decision that saved the principality from extinction. This was the essence of the man, a force of devastating violence but limited strategic vision. He was a formidable, fearsome presence, yet also a figure of human contradiction. Even Arab chroniclers, while praising his military zeal, noted his notorious weakness for wine, often describing him planning campaigns or receiving envoys while deeply in his cups. It was a flaw that humanized the monster, a reminder that these titans of the battlefield were still men, capable of both brilliant cruelty and simple vice. The Field of Blood was his masterpiece, a victory so complete it echoed the disaster at Hattin a century later, proving that the Crusader states could be bled dry, not just by great sultans, but by the relentless ambition of a frontier lord with a taste for terror and a head for strong drink. The terror of the Field of Blood cast a long shadow, but the man who wielded that terror left a successor just as sharp. Balak ibn Bahram, nephew to the formidable Ilghazi, was an Ayyubid commander who operated not with his uncle's brute force, but with a cunning that turned the capture of a king into a masterstroke of psychological warfare. His career was a brief, brilliant flare of ambition, proving that the Crusader kingdoms, even at their height, were never truly safe. In the spring of 1123, King Baldwin II of Jerusalem was campaigning in the northern reaches of his realm near the county of Edessa. Balak, ruling from his strongholds, saw an opportunity not for a pitched battle but for a perfect trap. He learned the king was staying at the small fortress of Carpet with only a modest escort. What happened next is a tale of deception straight from a spy's handbook. Balak sent a small contingent of his own soldiers, disguised as friendly Armenian Christians, to approach the fortress. They carried a forged letter, supposedly from the Frankish Count of Edessa, urgently requesting the king's immediate aid against a sudden Muslim attack. Baldwin, trusting the message and the familiar faces of his supposed allies, gathered his knights and rode out to answer the call. He had ridden straight into an ambush. The disguised soldiers led the royal party directly into a narrow pass where Balak's main force was hidden. Surrounded and overwhelmed, King Baldwin II, the ruler of Jerusalem, was taken prisoner. The political shock was immediate and profound. The Kingdom of Jerusalem was suddenly leaderless, its most powerful figure now a captive in the dank dungeons of Carpet Castle. For the Crusader states, this was a crisis that threatened their very existence. A frantic regency was established in Jerusalem, and negotiations for the king's ransom began. The price Balak demanded was staggering, not just in gold and silver, but in territory and prisoners. He held the ultimate bargaining chip, and he knew it. The negotiations dragged on for months, a tense diplomatic chess game where every move was calculated. Balak, meanwhile, did not rest on his triumph. He used the king's captivity as a strategic shield, launching raids and campaigns against vulnerable Crusader outposts, knowing they were paralyzed by the crisis at the top. He was a constant, buzzing threat, a reminder of their fragility. Baldwin's eventual release after a year of captivity and the payment of a colossal ransom did not end Balak's campaign. He continued his relentless pressure, moving to besiege the strategic town of Manbij. It was here, in 1124, that his meteoric career met a sudden end. During the siege, he was struck by an arrow, a random shot from the walls that found its mark. The wound proved fatal. Balak ibn Bahram died as he had lived on the attack, his ambitions cut short. His story, though brief, is a critical chapter. He demonstrated that even without the vast armies of a sultan, a single clever and ruthless commander could bring a kingdom to its knees. The capture of a king was not just a military victory, it was a symbol, a proof that the Frankish grip on the Holy Land was always more tenuous than it appeared. vulnerable to the next clever ruse, the next sudden ambush in a lonely mountain pass. The capture of a king showed the Crusaders' vulnerability, but the true threat was being built in the shadows by a family of power brokers. Saladin did not rise to power in a vacuum. He was lifted onto the shoulders of two formidable uncles whose ambition carved out the very empire he would inherit. The first was Asad ad-Din Shirkuh, a mountain of a man both in physique and in military reputation. He was the right hand of Nur ad-Din in Syria, a loyal and fiercely ambitious general known for his strength and strategic cunning. His destiny, however, was tied not to Syria but to the rich, chaotic lands of Egypt. The Fatimid Caliphate in Cairo was crumbling, torn apart by palace intrigues and a collapsing economy. Its viziers, the real power behind the Shia Caliph, were locked in a deadly struggle. One faction, desperate for an ally, appealed to Nur ad-Din for military aid. This was the opening Shirkuh had waited for. He convinced his master to let him lead an expedition, and he brought along his young nephew, Salah ad-Din, giving the future sultan his first taste of high-stakes command. Shirkuh's campaigns in Egypt were a brutal three-act drama of invasion, retreat, and ultimate triumph. His first expedition in 1164 was a bold raid that achieved little but demonstrated his audacity. The second, in 1167, saw him win a major battle, only to be outmaneuvered politically and forced to withdraw, but Shirkuh was relentless. In his third and final campaign in early 1169, he marched into Egypt with a smaller but veteran army. He faced not only rival Fatimid factions, but also a joint force of the remaining Fatimid troops and their new, unlikely allies, Crusaders from the Kingdom of Jerusalem, who feared a strong Muslim power uniting on their southern border. In a desperate, brilliant move at the Battle of al-Babain, Shirkuh used a feigned retreat to lure the larger enemy force into a trap, securing a decisive victory. The path to Cairo was now open. The Fatimid Caliph had no choice but to appoint the victorious Kurdish general as his new vizier, the supreme military and political authority. Just 2 months later, however, Shirkuh was dead, reportedly from a sudden illness after a lavish feast. His sudden departure left a vacuum, and into that vacuum stepped his 31-year-old nephew, Saladin, who was chosen to succeed him as vizier of Egypt. Shirkuh's legacy was not a long reign but a perfect setup. Through sheer force of will and military skill, he had transplanted the Zengid, and more specifically the Ayyubid family, into the seat of power in the wealthiest country in the region. He handed Saladin the keys to a kingdom, but Egypt alone was not enough. To confront the Crusaders, Saladin needed Syria, and that bridge was held by his other uncle, Shams ad-Dawla Turan Shah. While Shirkuh was the sword, Turan Shah was the administrator, the political anchor. After Saladin consolidated power in Egypt, he sent Turan Shah westward on a campaign of expansion into Libya and Yemen, securing his southern flank and bringing in new revenues. But Turan Shah's most critical role was in Syria. Following the death of Nur ad-Din in 1174, Syria descended into a contest between the late sultan's young heir and his powerful emirs. Saladin, now ruling Egypt independently, saw his chance to unite the two realms. He marched into Syria, but he needed a loyal, capable ruler to hold Damascus, the most important city, while he campaigned elsewhere. That man was Turan Shah. Appointed as governor, he proved to be a steady and effective ruler, maintaining order, managing finances, and ensuring Damascus remained a loyal base for his nephew's growing power. He was the reliable hand on the home front, the man who kept the machinery of state running so Saladin could focus on the grand strategy of war and diplomacy. Together, these two uncles represent the dual engines of empire building, the conqueror and the consolidator. Shirkuh's violent, risky gambit in Egypt provided the resources and the strategic depth. Turan Shah's competent governance in Syria provided the stability and the geographic platform. Without Shirkuh's daring invasions, Saladin would have remained a provincial officer in Nur ad-Din's army. Without Turan Shah's reliable stewardship, Saladin's gains in Syria could have easily unraveled. They were the architects in the shadows, the men who built the stage so their nephew could step into the light and change history. The empire Shirkuh and Turan Shah helped build now needed a master of detail to sustain it. That man was al-Adil I, known to the Crusaders as Saladin, the younger brother who served as Saladin's indispensable right hand. If Saladin was the visionary who united the Muslim world, al-Adil was the brilliant administrator who made that unity function. He was not merely a supporting character. He was the chief operating officer of a vast, fragile enterprise, a role that required a mind equally sharp for logistics, diplomacy, and war. His loyalty was absolute, but his talents were distinct. While Saladin inspired armies, al-Adil organized them. He commanded crucial wings of the army at the Great Victory of Hattin and during the subsequent sieges, proving himself a cool and competent battlefield commander. But his true genius emerged away from the clamor of combat, in the quiet tents of negotiation and the ledgers of state. It was al-Adil whom Saladin trusted to handle the most delicate diplomatic missions, a trust that placed him directly across the table from Richard the Lionheart. Their negotiations were a marathon of wit and will. Al-Adil, with his polished manners and shrewd political mind, became Richard's preferred interlocutor. It was to al-Adil that Richard famously, and perhaps half in jest, proposed marrying his sister Joan, offering Jerusalem as a wedding gift to unite their families. While the offer was impossible for many reasons, the fact it was made to al-Adil speaks volumes about the respect he commanded. He mastered the art of talking while fighting, securing truces that bought the Ayyubid state precious time to breathe and regroup. When Saladin died in 1193, the empire did not automatically pass to him. It fractured as was customary among Saladin's sons and nephews. Al-Adil, as the senior statesman of the family, initially worked from behind the scenes, but the young Ayyubid princes soon fell into squabbling, threatening to undo all of Saladin's work. With weary pragmatism, al-Adil stepped forward. Over the next decade, through a complex blend of diplomacy, strategic marriage alliances, and occasional military force, he systematically gathered the pieces. He did not conquer his relatives so much as outmaneuver them, convincing some to yield power, confining others to lesser provinces, and defeating those who refused to bend. By 1200, he had reunified the core of the empire under his own rule as sultan. His reign was defined by this relentless pragmatism. He fought the Crusaders when necessary, recapturing key fortresses, but he much preferred stable treaties that guaranteed peace and profitable trade. He understood that a prosperous, well-administered realm was a stronger defense than a perpetually mobilized army. He reformed the tax system, invested in infrastructure, and fortified cities, building a state designed to endure. In character, he was everything his brother was not, less a charismatic hero of faith and more a calculating sovereign of statecraft. Where Saladin spent lavishly from the treasury, often leaving it empty, al-Adil was a careful steward of resources. Where Saladin's chivalry was instinctive and personal, al-Adil's diplomacy was cool and strategic. This has led some historians to see him as the true architect of lasting Ayyubid power, the man who transformed his brother's military coalition into a workable dynasty. He ruled for nearly 2 decades, a period of relative stability that allowed the Ayyubid system to take root. When he died in 1218, he passed on a consolidated empire, a framework strong enough to withstand the coming storms, and a legacy that proves sometimes the most important warrior is not the one who wins the glory, but the one who secures the peace. Al-Adil's careful stewardship secured the empire, but it would be his son who faced an offer that could have rewritten history. Sultan al-Kamil Muhammad al-Malik, a grandson of Saladin, inherited the Ayyubid throne in Egypt in 1218, and his reign was immediately consumed by fire. The Fifth Crusade had landed not in Palestine, but on the banks of the Nile, aiming to conquer Egypt itself, the wealthy heart of Muslim power. By 1219, the Crusader army, bolstered by forces from across Europe, had captured the vital port city of Damietta after a grueling, plague-ridden siege. This was a catastrophe. With Damietta as their base, the invaders could sail up the Nile and threaten Cairo itself. Al-Kamil was in a desperate position, his authority shaken by the military disaster and by internal rivals within his own family who saw his vulnerability as their opportunity. The Sultan's camp was a place of tension and fear, the very survival of the Ayyubid state in Egypt hanging by a thread. It was from this position of profound weakness, not strength, that al-Kamil made one of the most astonishing diplomatic proposals of the entire crusading era. He sent envoys to the Crusader commanders with an offer that must have left them stunned. In exchange for their evacuation of Egypt and the return of Damietta, al-Kamil promised to hand over the kingdom of Jerusalem. Not just the city itself, but most of the original lands lost at Hattin, including key fortresses. He even offered to finance the rebuilding of Jerusalem's city walls, which had been dismantled years earlier, and to return the fragment of the true cross, the most sacred relic lost in Saladin's victory. For a moment, the entire bloody struggle of nearly a century and a half could have been resolved with a pen stroke. The Crusaders would achieve their stated holy goal without another battle. So why would a Muslim sultan offer the holy city? The answer lies in cold, pragmatic calculation. For al-Kamil, Egypt was everything. It was the source of his dynasty's wealth, its grain, and its military manpower. Losing Damietta was a crisis, but losing Cairo would be the end. Jerusalem, by contrast, was a symbolically potent but strategically burdensome inland city, expensive to defend and surrounded by hostile Crusader ports. By trading it away, he could eliminate the immediate existential threat to his power base, secure his throne against his internal rivals, and live to fight another day. He could always attempt to retake Jerusalem later once his position was secure. The offer was a masterstroke of realpolitik, placing the burden of choice squarely on the Crusaders. And they chose poorly. The army was deeply divided. Many knights and local barons who understood the immense value of the deal were in favor of accepting. They had come to reclaim the holy places, and here they were being handed them. But the papal legate, Cardinal Pelagius of Albano, held ultimate authority. He was a man of uncompromising religious zeal who believed divine favor would grant them not just Jerusalem but all of Egypt. He argued that accepting the offer would be a sin, a lack of faith in God's plan for total victory. Influenced by Pelagius and visions from a mystic, the Crusader leadership refused al-Kamil's breathtaking offer. They pressed their advantage, marching south toward Cairo. It was a fatal mistake. The following year, al-Kamil's forces, now reinforced and exploiting the annual Nile flood, trapped the Crusader army in the delta. Cut off and starving, they were forced to surrender. The price for their freedom was the unconditional return of Damietta and a humiliating 8-year truce. They left Egypt with nothing, having turned down the very kingdom they sought. This moment stands as one of history's great what-if scenarios. What if the knights had overruled the cardinal? A Christian Jerusalem, secured by treaty, might have changed the entire trajectory of the conflict, perhaps leading to a more stable coexistence. Instead, the refusal guaranteed decades more warfare. Al-Kamil's offer reveals the hidden engine of these wars, the complex political calculations where dynastic survival and cold strategy often mattered far more than the abstract ideals of holy war. Al-Kamil's pragmatic offer was refused, but the world of shared aristocratic values it hinted at was very real, embodied by men like Fakhr ad-Din. This prominent Ayyubid emir was not just a commander, he was a bridge between cultures, a man who moved as easily through the tournament fields of Frankish nobles as he did through the war councils of sultans. Serving under Sultan al-Kamil and later his son as Salih Ayyub, Fakhr ad-Din was a pillar of the Ayyubid military elite during the turbulent later Crusades. His career was a testament to the complex, layered reality of the era, where periods of brutal conflict were punctuated by stretches of truce filled with surprising camaraderie. His most critical military test came from an unexpected and terrifying direction. In 1244, a horde of Khwarezmian Turkic mercenaries, displaced and desperate after the Mongol destruction of their homeland, surged into Syria. These were ferocious, undisciplined fighters who recognized no allegiance except to plunder. They sacked Jerusalem, a shocking blow to both Muslim and Christian prestige. Fakhr ad-Din was tasked with confronting this wildcard threat. He led Ayyubid forces against them, part of a coalition effort to drive these destructive invaders from the region, a fight that underscored how the old enemies of the Crusades could find common cause against a new, chaotic foe. Yet it was in his dealings with the Franks that Fakhr ad-Din truly defined his legacy. During the Sixth Crusade, led by the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II, he served as Sultan al-Kamil's chief negotiator. Frederick was a famously cultured and curious ruler, more inclined to diplomacy than battle, and he found in Fakhr ad-Din a perfect counterpart. Their negotiations were conducted with mutual respect, a meeting of minds that transcended the usual religious hostility. This personal rapport helped facilitate the extraordinary Treaty of Jaffa in 1229, where Jerusalem was peacefully returned to Christian control through a 10-year truce, fulfilling through diplomacy what decades of warfare had failed to achieve. But Fakhr ad-Din's chivalry was not confined to the negotiating table. He was renowned for participating in the martial games of the Frankish aristocracy. He would engage in friendly jousts with knights, compete in archery contests, and exchange lavish gifts. He learned some French, enjoyed Frankish music, and hosted Crusader nobles at his own gatherings. To the chroniclers of the time, he seemed the very model of a Saracen knight, a mirror image of the ideals celebrated in European courts. His story peels back the curtain on a hidden layer of the Crusader world, one where elite warriors on both sides, bound by shared codes of honor, martial skill, and a taste for luxury, often felt more kinship with each other than with the common soldiers or peasants of their own faith. This was a world of personal bonds that could at times soften the edges of holy war. Fakhr ad-Din represents the nuance, the periods where conflict paused and humanity, with all its shared traditions of nobility, briefly took center stage, reminding us that history is never a simple story of us versus them, but a tangled web of rivalries, respect, and unexpected friendship. The chivalric world of Fakhr ad-Din existed in sunlight, but a far more terrifying power operated from the shadows, ruling not by armies, but by the whispered threat of a single knife. In the jagged mountains of Syria, a secret state flourished, one that mastered a form of warfare so precise and psychological it paralyzed kings and sultans alike. This was the domain of the Nizari Ismailis, a Shia Muslim sect known to history simply as the Assassins. Persecuted and driven from the centers of power in Persia, they sought refuge in the most inaccessible places, carving out a network of impregnable fortresses perched on sheer cliff faces. Their theology was complex, centered on a living spiritual leader they believed to be the true Imam, a direct descendant of the Prophet. But to the outside world, their faith was overshadowed by their terrifying methodology. They did not wage conventional war. Their weapon was political assassination carried out by the Fidai, the devoted ones. These were not mere hired killers. They were young men, often recruited and indoctrinated from childhood, taught that a martyr's death in service to their Imam guaranteed paradise. Their training was legendary, involving infiltration, languages, and the patient study of a target's habits, all to find that one perfect public moment to strike. The psychological impact was genius, for how can you fight an enemy who values his own life less than your death? The most famous master of this shadow war in Syria was Rashid ad-Din Sinan, known to the Crusaders as the Old Man of the Mountain. From his fortress stronghold of Masyaf, he ruled the Syrian assassins for 3 decades with absolute authority, a sovereign of fear. He understood that his small sect's survival depended on being too dangerous to provoke. His fidais struck with chilling efficiency. Their targets read like a who's who of the era. They attempted the life of the great Saladin himself not once but twice. The first attempt saw 2 fidais infiltrate his camp, wounding him before being cut down. The second, more daring plot involved fidais disguising themselves as soldiers in his own army, a breach of security that left the Sultan so unnerved he reportedly entered into a wary, unspoken truce with Sinan. Another prominent victim was Conrad of Montferrat, the charismatic king of Jerusalem, stabbed to death on a street in Tyre just days before his coronation, a murder that reshaped the kingdom's leadership. The assassins did not discriminate by faith. They targeted any leader who threatened their independence. This led them into a labyrinth of pragmatic, temporary alliances that defied the simple Crusader versus Muslim narrative. In a stunning move, they occasionally cooperated with the Knights Templar, their ideological opposites, when it served to counter a common Muslim enemy like Nur ad-Din or Saladin. They provided valuable intelligence and even coordinated military actions, a partnership of pure convenience between 2 secretive, militant orders. Their greatest strength was their mountain fortresses like Masyaf and Al-Kaf. These were not just castles, they were symbolic hearts of their mystery, seemingly unreachable and unassailable. Legends grew that Sinan possessed supernatural powers, that he drugged his followers with hashish to give them visions of paradise, hence the name assassin, derived from hashashin. While this is likely a myth spread by their enemies, it added to their aura of otherworldly menace. In the end, the assassins' power was not in the number of their killings, but in the climate of dread they cultivated. Every ruler, whether in Acre or Damascus, had to wonder if the smiling servant pouring his wine was a fidai waiting for a signal. They were the ultimate wild card, a reminder that in the medieval Middle East, the greatest threats often came not from the battlefield, but from a silent figure in a crowded market, for whom death was not a risk but a guaranteed reward. The shadowy power of the assassins was a constant threat, but the greatest danger to the Ayyubid Empire often came from within the palace walls. Saif ad-Din Ali, known by his regal title al-Malik al-Aziz, was a son of Saladin, handed the rich throne of Egypt while still in his 20s. His inheritance was immense, the wealthiest and most powerful slice of his father's fragmented empire. Yet from the start, his reign was defined not by glorious expansion, but by a desperate struggle to hold onto what he had been given. The unity Saladin had forged through force of personality did not automatically transfer to his sons. Al-Aziz found himself surrounded by uncles and brothers, each ruling their own provinces, each watching Cairo with a mix of jealousy and ambition. His authority was a fragile thing, constantly questioned by the very family that should have been his greatest support. To prove himself a worthy heir to the great Sultan, he knew he needed a military victory, a campaign that would echo his father's triumphs. His eyes turned north to the remaining Crusader holdings in Palestine. He assembled a formidable army and marched from Egypt, intent on besieging the powerful fortress of Jaffa. This was to be his statement, proof that he could wield the sword as effectively as Saladin. But the campaign unraveled almost before it began. The logistics were a nightmare, the coordination with other Ayyubid princes faltered, and the Crusaders were prepared. More critically, his most powerful relative, his uncle al-Adil, the brilliant administrator who ruled Syria, saw this independent campaign as a threat. Al-Adil had no desire to see his nephew grow too strong and potentially challenge his own preeminent position within the family. Through diplomatic pressure and perhaps covert opposition, he helped ensure the campaign stalled. Al-Aziz was forced to retreat back to Egypt, his military ambitions humbled, his authority further weakened in the eyes of his emirs and soldiers. This familial conflict, this tension between nephew and uncle, was a symptom of the deeper flaw in the Ayyubid system. It was a family confederation, not a centralized state. Without Saladin's overwhelming charisma to bind them, the sons and uncles began to view each other as rivals for the true mantle of power. Yet, al-Aziz's story is not one of complete failure. Understanding that legacy could also be built in stone, he initiated one of the most enduring monuments of medieval Cairo. He began construction on a massive fortified complex on the Muqattam Hills, a citadel that would dominate the city's skyline. This was not just a palace, it was a statement of permanent, impregnable rule. He moved the seat of government there, signaling a break from the old Fatimid palaces below. Though he would not live to see its completion, the citadel of Cairo became his most tangible legacy, expanded and finished by his successors and later by the Mamluk sultans who would ultimately supplant his dynasty. It stands to this day, a fortress built by a prince trying to secure a throne that was already slipping from his family's grasp. Al-Malik al-Aziz died suddenly in 1198 after a fall from his horse during a hunting accident. His reign lasted less than 5 years. His young son was immediately pushed aside by his uncle, al-Adil, who finally seized the sultanate for himself. The brief, troubled rule of al-Aziz is a pivotal, tragic chapter. It illustrates the harsh truth that follows many great founders. The second generation often lacks the magic that built the empire, yet inherits all its rivalries. His attempts to assert himself militarily and architecturally were the actions of a man straining under the weight of a legendary father's name, fighting a battle for legitimacy he was destined to lose. This internal fracturing, this dynasty turning its energy inward, created the cracks through which a new power, the slave-soldier Mamluks, would eventually rise to command everything. While the Ayyubid princes quarreled over their inheritance, a storm was gathering in the east that would make their disputes seem trivial. By 1258, the Islamic world was reeling from a series of hammer blows. Hulagu Khan, grandson of Genghis, led a Mongol army of terrifying size and efficiency. They had sacked Baghdad, extinguishing the 500-year-old Abbasid Caliphate and drowning its libraries and palaces in blood. They swept through Syria, crushing every army sent against them. The great cities of Aleppo and Damascus fell without a fight, their rulers fleeing or submitting. The Mongols seemed utterly unstoppable, an apocalyptic force that erased empires from the map. Their advanced scouts reached the very borders of Egypt. The message they sent to Cairo was not a declaration of war, but a demand for unconditional surrender. It promised annihilation for those who resisted and subjugation for those who bowed. In this moment of absolute peril, when the survival of Islam in the region hung by a thread, a man of stark purpose seized the throne. His name was al-Muzaffar Saif ad-Din Qutuz, and he was a Mamluk, a military slave who had risen through the ranks to become a powerful commander. He did not seize power for wealth or dynastic ambition. He seized it because someone had to face the Mongols, and the reigning sultan was a boy more interested in polo than preparing for the end of the world. In a swift and bloodless coup, Qutuz deposed the young ruler and declared himself sultan. His first act was to tear up the Mongol ultimatum. He told his council, if we submit, they will take our wealth and our lives. If we fight, we at least have a chance to die with honor. He then issued a call to arms that was both desperate and brilliant. He rallied the Mamluk regiments in Egypt, the most disciplined professional soldiers in the region. But he knew it was not enough. He needed every sword. He reached out to the rival Mamluk factions that had been expelled from Egypt years earlier, including a formidable and bitter commander named Baibars. This was a masterstroke of pragmatism. Baibars had every reason to hate Qutuz, but the Mongol threat was greater than any personal grievance. Qutuz offered not just reconciliation, but a position of high command. Baibars, recognizing the scale of the crisis, accepted. The two former rivals now stood side by side, unifying the Mamluk military machine for a single purpose. Qutuz emptied the treasury to pay his troops, and he levied emergency taxes, justifying it as a cost of survival. He framed the coming battle not as a war for territory, but as a sacred defense of Islam itself, a jihad against the pagan invaders who had destroyed the caliphate. In the summer of 1260, he led his combined force out of Egypt and into Palestine, marching toward the Mongol army that now occupied Syria. The two forces met near a spring called Ain Jalut, the Spring of Goliath, in a valley between the hills of Galilee and the mountains of Samaria. The atmosphere was thick with dread. The Mamluks were outnumbered, facing the legendary Mongol cavalry that had conquered continents, but Qutuz and his commanders, especially Baibars, had a plan. They understood Mongol tactics, and they intended to use them against their creators. The fate of the world as they knew it would be decided not in a grand, open plain, but in this narrow valley where the seemingly unstoppable tide of history was about to meet an unbreakable wall of slave soldiers who had chosen to stand and fight. The valley of Ain Jalut was a killing ground chosen with perfect care. Sultan Qutuz and his commanders, including the formidable Baibars, arrayed their Mamluk forces with the steep hills at their backs and their flanks protected by dense vegetation. They knew the Mongol playbook, a relentless storm of horse archers who would encircle and shred a static enemy. So they wrote a new page in it. Baibars, commanding the vanguard, advanced with a portion of the army to make first contact with the Mongol host led by the Christian Naaman commander Kitbuka. The clash was fierce but brief. Then, on a prearranged signal, Baibars' troops turned and fled, scattering in apparent panic back toward the hills. It was a classic feigned retreat, the very tactic the Mongols had used to destroy so many armies. Kitbuka, confident and perhaps contemptuous of these slave soldiers, took the bait. He ordered a full pursuit, his cavalry thundering into the narrowing valley, chasing what they believed was a broken enemy. This was the moment Qutuz had prayed for. As the Mongol vanguard surged forward, they lost their cohesion and stretched their lines. They rode directly into a prepared trap. Hidden in the hills, the main Mamluk force, held in reserve by Qutuz, erupted from concealment. Arrows rained down, and then the heavy Mamluk cavalry charged from the high ground, smashing into the Mongol flanks. At the same moment, Baibars' fleeing troops wheeled around, their retreat transformed into a counterattack. The Mongols were caught in a vice. The battle dissolved into a brutal, close-quarters melee in the dust and heat. The Mongol discipline, so legendary, finally broke under the shock of the ambush and the ferocity of the Mamluk heavy horsemen. Kitbuka fought desperately, refusing to flee until he was unhorsed and captured. Brought before Qutuz, he was executed on the spot, a final, decisive blow. The remaining Mongol forces scattered in retreat. The immediate outcome was a strategic earthquake. Hulagu Khan, upon hearing of the disaster, was forced to withdraw his main army east to deal with a succession crisis, leaving Syria undefended. The Mamluks swept north, reclaiming Damascus and Aleppo within weeks. In a single afternoon at a forgotten spring, Qutuz and Baibars had not just won a battle, they had reversed the tide of the apocalypse. The long-term impact of Ain Jalut cannot be overstated. It saved Egypt, and with it the remaining Islamic heartland, from almost certain destruction. It reshaped the global balance of power, proving the Mongol war machine could be broken in open battle, which emboldened other states to resist. Most significantly, it marked the permanent western limit of the Mongol Empire's expansion. They would never again pose a serious threat to the Levant or North Africa. The victory announced the Mamluks as the new masters of the region, a slave soldier dynasty born from the ashes of empires, whose authority was forged in the moment they stared down the end of the world and did not blink. The salvation of Ain Jalut secured the Mamluk throne, but the final chapter of the Crusades remained unwritten. That task fell to a sultan who embodied the cold, methodical purpose of the Mamluk machine, al-Ashraf Khalil. He was the son of Sultan Kalawan, a master builder and strategist who had spent his own reign methodically dismantling the last remnants of the Crusader states, fortress by fortress. Khalid had captured the great hospital fortress of Margat and the city of Tripoli, but he died before he could reach the ultimate prize. On his deathbed, he reportedly made his son, Khalid, swear an oath to complete the mission, to erase the Frankish presence from the coast once and for all. Khalid inherited not just a throne but a sacred family vendetta against history itself. He took power in 1290 and he moved with a terrifying, singular focus. His target was Acre, the glittering, cosmopolitan capital of what was left of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. For over a century, it had been the heart of Crusader power, a bustling port of merchants, knights, and diplomats protected by massive double walls and a deep moat. It was a symbol of endurance, and Khalid was determined to break it. In the spring of 1291, he marched from Cairo at the head of the most formidable army the Mamluks had ever assembled. Chroniclers speak of a force of over 100,000, including tens of thousands of professional cavalry and a corps of engineers with a train of nearly 100 massive siege engines, mangonels and trebuchets capable of hurling stones heavier than a man. The sight of this army surrounding Acre, its banners blotting out the horizon, must have been one of pure dread. The siege began in April. Khalid's strategy was not a patient blockade, but an overwhelming, concentrated hammer blow. His engineers assembled their great stone throwers in batteries, and they began a relentless day and night bombardment against the city's famed walls. The thunder of the engines and the crash of stone against masonry was constant, a physical and psychological assault meant to grind the defenders into dust. For weeks the walls shook, sections of the outer fortifications crumbled into rubble. The Crusaders, a desperate mix of knights from various orders, Italian mariners and local levies, fought with the courage of the doomed, launching sorties and making frantic repairs under a hail of arrows and Greek fire. But they were hopelessly outnumbered and outgunned. Khalid, supervising the siege from a lavish pavilion, was implacable. The final assault came on May 18th. With a critical section of the outer wall reduced to ruins, the Mamluk troops surged forward. They poured across the rubble, meeting the last stand of the Knights Templar and Hospitaller in the streets and towers. The fighting was house to house, room to room, a brutal close-quarters slaughter in the smoke and chaos. The city's last defenders fell back to the waterfront, where a few managed to escape on waiting ships. Most did not. The Mamluks took the city in a storm of blood and fire. The magnitude of the loss sent a seismic shock through Christendom. Acre had been the bridgehead for every crusade for generations. Its fall meant there was no longer a foothold, no safe harbor for any future army from the west. But Khalid was not finished. To ensure the Franks could never return, he gave a chilling order. His engineers systematically demolished Acre's mighty walls and towers, reducing the proud capital to a useless heap of stone. He then turned his army north up the coast in a campaign of final erasure. The great ports of Tyre, Sidon, Beirut, and Tartus surrendered or were stormed in quick succession. Their fortifications were methodically torn down, their harbors filled with rubble. By the end of 1291, every significant Crusader castle and city on the Syrian and Palestinian coast was a ruin, its Latin population killed, enslaved, or fled. The work begun by Imad ad-Din Zengi, refined by Nur ad-Din, achieved by Saladin, and secured by the Mamluks at Ain Jalut was now complete. Al-Ashraf Khalid had not just won a war, he had ended an era. 2 centuries of Crusader kingdoms, with all their complexity, chivalry, and conflict, vanished from the mainland almost overnight, leaving only broken stones by the sea and a legend of an impossible dream that finally, definitively died. Al-Ashraf Khalid's final, crushing blow was made possible by the relentless groundwork of his father. Khalid's story is the very blueprint of Mamluk power, a journey from a purchased slave to the architect of an empire. He was known as Al-Alfi, the Thousand Man, for the high price of 1,000 dinars paid for him, marking him as a soldier of exceptional potential from the start. His career mirrored that of Baibars, rising through the elite ranks of the Bari regiment, proving his valor at the decisive Battle of Ain Jalut, and navigating the treacherous politics of the Mamluk court with a cool, calculating mind. When he finally seized the Sultanate in 1279, it was not through a dramatic coup, but through a patient, strategic consolidation of support among the military elite. He understood that to rule the Mamluks, you had to be the most formidable Mamluk of all. His reign was a masterclass in pragmatic, long-term strategy, facing threats on two fronts. From the east, the Ilkhanate Mongols, though checked at Ain Jalut, remained a persistent danger, launching repeated invasions of Syria. Kalawan met them in battle, securing the frontier not with one glorious victory, but with unwavering defensive readiness, ensuring the safety of his core territories. His western front, however, was where he executed a meticulous, decade-long campaign. The remaining Crusader states were weakened, but their coastal fortresses were still formidable. Kalawan approached them not with blind fury, but with the precision of a chess player. He was a master of the strategic truce. He would sign peace treaties with a Crusader city, sometimes for 10 years, swearing solemn oaths to guarantee their safety. These were not acts of goodwill, they were tactical pauses. He used the peace to trade, to gather intelligence, and to isolate his target from its potential allies. Then, when the moment was perfect and the treaty neared its end or a convenient pretext could be manufactured, he would move. His armies would appear without warning and the siege would begin. This is exactly what happened with the mighty Hospitaller fortress of Markab or Margat in 1285. Perched on a volcanic plug overlooking the sea, it was considered nearly impregnable. Kalawan besieged it with a massive force and his superior siege engines. When a lucky shot from a Mamluk mangonel ignited the fortress's internal storerooms, causing a catastrophic explosion, the defenders' will broke. They surrendered on terms, allowed to depart safely, and Kalawan gained the greatest castle in Syria. His most infamous use of this tactic came with Tripoli. He had signed a 10-year treaty with the Lady of Tyre, who ruled the city. Just months later, when a group of Crusaders from Tripoli raided a Muslim village, Kalawan declared the treaty void due to this violation. His army marched, and in 1289, after a brutal siege, Tripoli fell. The city was sacked, its population enslaved, and its physical existence as a Crusader capital erased. This cold, calculating diplomacy, where oaths were tools rather than bonds, showed a new kind of warfare, one waged in the chancery as effectively as on the battlefield. Yet the man who could break treaties so ruthlessly was also a monumental builder. His most enduring legacy stands in the heart of Cairo, the Maristan or hospital complex of Kalawan. This was not a simple clinic, it was a sprawling center of healing and learning, an architectural marvel that included a hospital, a madrasa, and a mausoleum for his family. The hospital was revolutionary, divided into wards for different illnesses, with running water, pharmacies, and a staff of physicians, surgeons, and ophthalmologists. It treated all citizens, rich and poor, Muslim and Christian, for free. This project reveals the dual soul of the Mamluk state and of Kalawan himself. Here was a sultan, a former slave soldier, who could order the destruction of cities with one hand and commission a palace of mercy with the other. His rule was a fusion of terrifying militarism and sophisticated, almost paternal state patronage. He built mosques, schools, and public fountains alongside his fortifications. In doing so, he solidified the system. He made the Mamluk Sultanate not just a military dictatorship, but a legitimate, enduring civilization. He created the stable, powerful engine that his son, Khalid, would later drive to its final, devastating victory, proving that empires are built not only by the sword, but by the careful, cunning hands of a master builder. The ruthless calculus of Kalawan's statecraft required a vast treasury, and that vault was guarded by a man who knew the price of everything. Baibars II, known as al-Jashnakir, the Taster, began not as a sultan but as the ultimate insider. His power was not measured in armies commanded on distant frontiers, but in the quiet authority of the palace chamberlain and the state treasurer. He controlled access to the sultan, managed the imperial household, and most critically held the keys to the Mamluk treasury. In a system where loyalty was purchased with regular pay and lavish gifts, the man who distributed the gold wielded immense, subtle influence. He built a network of clients and allies not on the battlefield, but in the corridors of power, becoming the indispensable vizier to a series of sultans. His moment came in a familiar cycle of Mamluk politics, the regency for a child ruler. When the formidable Sultan an-Nasir Muhammad was deposed as a boy, Baibars II stepped from the shadows of finance into the light of authority, first as regent and then, in 1309, as sultan in his own right. His reign was brief, just under a year, but it illuminates the volatile engine of the Mamluk state. Here was a ruler who had never led a great army to victory, whose legitimacy came from administrative control and backroom alliances rather than martial glory. His policies reflected this. He focused on internal stability, attempting to balance the budget strained by his predecessors' wars and building projects. He engaged in the expected patronage, commissioning a beautiful madrasa in Cairo that still stands, a monument to a sultan who ruled more with a ledger than a lance. Yet in the Mamluk world, such a basis for power was inherently fragile. The military elite, the amirs whose loyalty was the true foundation of any sultan's throne, viewed a treasurer sultan with deep suspicion. They were warriors who respected proven command, not financial management. The deposed an-Nasir Muhammad, now a young man, watched from exile, waiting for his chance. The conflict was inevitable. When an-Nasir returned to Syria and began gathering support from disaffected amirs, Baibars II faced the ultimate test. He marched out to confront the challenge, but his rule had already crumbled from within. His own commanders, perhaps doubting his martial resolve or making a calculated switch, abandoned him. Without a fight, his reign evaporated. He was captured and, in the brutal tradition of Mamluk successions, promptly executed. His story is a critical footnote in the saga of the slave sultans. Baibars II demonstrates that even at the peak of Mamluk imperial strength, the throne itself was a precarious seat. Power could be seized from the treasury as easily as from the battlefield, but it could only be held with the unwavering consent of the warrior class whose culture valued the sword above all else. His rapid rise and fall underscore the relentless, often bloody competition among the elite, a system where today's royal treasurer could be tomorrow's sultan, and the day after a forgotten corpse, a reminder that the greatest threats to these formidable rulers often came from within their own palace walls. The treasurer's brief reign proved that in the Mamluk world, true power still rested with the warrior who could command loyalty on the battlefield. And Nasir Muhammad understood this from brutal experience. He had been sultan twice before, first as a child puppet and then as a young man, only to be deposed each time by powerful regents and emirs who saw him as weak. Those years of exile were not idle, they were an education in patience and realpolitik. He watched, he learned, and he forged secret alliances. When he returned for his third reign in 1310, he was no longer a boy to be manipulated, but a shrewd, determined ruler in his 30s, ready to rule in fact, not just in name. His first priority was to ensure he would never be overthrown again. He achieved this through a masterful, two-pronged strategy, balancing the sword with the purse. To secure the frontiers, he launched carefully calculated military campaigns. He marched against the Armenian kingdom of Cilicia, a lingering Crusader ally in the mountains, forcing it into vassalage and neutralizing it as a threat. More significantly, he maintained relentless pressure on the Ilkhanate Mongols, the descendants of Hulagu Khan. Through a combination of military raids and shrewd diplomacy, he helped ensure their final conversion to Islam and the disintegration of their state as a hostile power, permanently securing Syria's eastern border. The existential wars were over, the age of consolidation had begun. But Nasir Muhammad's true genius was domestic. He broke the power of the old, rebellious Mamluk factions by creating a new one loyal directly to him. He purchased thousands of new slaves, primarily Circassians from the Caucasus, and trained them as his personal corps, the Burji Mamluks. These men owed everything to the Sultan, and their presence diluted the influence of the established amirs. He then tied the entire elite to him through a revolutionary economic policy. He seized direct control of the state's vast agricultural lands and the lucrative spice trade, creating a royal monopoly. Instead of paying his emirs with cash from a central treasury, he granted them iqta, rights to the revenue from specific parcels of land. This made each commander's wealth dependent on the productivity and peace of his assigned district, incentivizing stability and tying their personal fortune to the health of the sultanate itself. It was a system of controlled patronage that bought 3 decades of internal peace. With the state secure and wealthy, Nasir Muhammad embarked on a building spree that physically stamped his authority on Cairo. His most iconic project was his monumental mosque and complex at the citadel. This was not just a place of prayer, it was a statement in stone. Its soaring minarets and vast courtyard were designed to awe, proclaiming the Sultan's piety and power. The complex included a madrasa, a hospital, and a mausoleum, but also something more innovative, a sprawling commercial arcade of shops and warehouses. He redirected the main trade route so that caravans from the Red Sea had to pass directly beneath the walls of his mosque, ensuring that the wealth of the empire flowed literally under his gaze, with taxes filling his coffers. This fusion of sacred, educational, and economic functions in one grand complex embodied his entire philosophy of rule, faith, knowledge, and commerce intertwined under the watchful eye of the Sultan. His long third reign, lasting until his death in 1341, represents the serene peak of the Mamluk Sultanate. The frantic fights for survival against Crusaders and Mongols were memories replaced by a confident, sophisticated empire. Nasir Muhammad had transformed the slave-soldier system into a stable dynasty, not by blood but by brilliant administration. He proved that the greatest victory is not just conquering your enemies, but building a world so prosperous and orderly that no one inside it dreams of rebellion. An era of serene prosperity could not last forever. Just as the Mamluks reached their peak under Nasir Muhammad, a new storm was gathering far to the east, a whirlwind of conquest that would sweep away kingdoms and leave pyramids of bones in its wake. His name was Timur, known to a terrified Europe as Tamerlane, and he was a Turco-Mongol warlord from the steppes of Central Asia who modeled himself after his ancestor Genghis Khan. Timur was not a Saracen warrior in any traditional sense. His empire was a patchwork of Persian, Turkic, and Mongol traditions, and his faith was a personal, often political, blend of Islam and steppe shamanism. But his shadow fell directly upon the world the Mamluks had built, and his invasion would be a cataclysm that tested their empire to its core. Timur's rise was a story of relentless, brutal ambition. A minor noble from the Baibars tribe, he began as a bandit and a mercenary, surviving battles that left him lame in one leg and with a paralyzed arm, injuries that earned him the Persian nickname Timur-i-Lang, Timur the Lame. Yet these wounds did not slow his march to power. Through sheer military genius and utter ruthlessness, he united the feuding tribes of Transoxiana, declaring himself the restorer of the Mongol Empire. His army was a terrifying instrument, a highly disciplined force combining heavy cavalry, expert horse archers, and innovative infantry units that used coordinated shield and spear tactics. But his true weapon was psychological warfare, a calculated campaign of terror designed to break the will of nations before his armies even arrived. He would offer cities a choice: surrender and pay tribute, or resist and face annihilation. Those who chose to fight witnessed horrors meant to echo across continents. After crushing a rebellion in the Persian city of Isfahan, he ordered the construction of towers from the skulls of the slain, a grim monument to the cost of defiance. This was the man who, by the turn of the 15th century, had already toppled the Golden Horde, shattered the Sultanate of Delhi, and subjugated the mighty Ottoman Empire, capturing their Sultan Bayezid I. His gaze then turned south toward the rich lands of Syria and the seat of Mamluk power in Cairo. The Mamluk Sultan of the time, an-Nasir Faraj, was a young and insecure ruler facing internal revolts. When Timur's vast army crossed the Euphrates River in late 1400, the response was fractured and slow. The Mamluk forces, still formidable, marched to meet him in Syria, but they were no longer the unified machine of Qutuz or Baibars. Timur, ever the tactician, lured them into a battle near Aleppo. He used his classic feigned retreat, drawing the Mamluk vanguard into a trap where his reserves encircled them. The Mamluk army was routed and Aleppo was stormed with appalling violence. Then Timur turned to the ultimate prize, Damascus, the city that had resisted Crusaders for centuries. The city's governor negotiated a surrender, promising a huge ransom to spare its people. Timur entered Damascus in December 1401, taking up residence in its great Umayyad mosque. But the promised tribute was slow to arrive, and a fire, possibly started by Timur's own troops, broke out in the city. Using this as a pretext, he gave the order. For 3 days, his soldiers sacked the ancient city. Artisans and scholars were rounded up and deported to Timur's capital at Samarkand, but thousands of ordinary citizens were not so lucky. Chroniclers of the time, their voices trembling with horror, described the streets running with blood and once more the erection of grisly towers made from human skulls, a signature of Timur's vengeance placed outside the city gates as a warning to all who might consider defiance. The great city of Nur ad-Din and Saladin was reduced to a smoldering ruin. Having shattered Syria, Timur then sent a chilling message to Cairo. He demanded the surrender of Sultan an-Nasir Faraj, threatening to turn Egypt into a desert of bones. The young sultan fled back to Cairo in panic, and his empire seemed on the brink of the same destruction that had swallowed Baghdad. But then, as suddenly as he had arrived, Timur turned away. News of a rebellion in the east demanded his attention, and the prospect of a long desert campaign into Egypt held little appeal when richer, closer lands were in revolt. He withdrew, leaving Syria broken and bleeding. The immediate impact was devastation, but the long-term consequence was a critical weakening of the Mamluk state. The economic heartland of Syria was ruined, its cities depopulated, its trade routes severed. The Mamluks' aura of invincibility, carefully maintained since Ain Jalut, was shattered. They would spend decades rebuilding, but they were now a diminished power, vulnerable to internal decay and to the rising threat from the north, the Ottomans, whom Timur had temporarily hobbled but not destroyed. Timur's invasion was a brutal punctuation mark at the end of an era, a reminder that the world of medieval warriors was giving way to the age of gunpowder empires, and that no fortress, no matter how mighty, was safe from the coming storm. The world Timur left behind was a smoking ruin, a fractured stage awaiting its final act. That act would be performed by a man standing on the crumbling edge of two empires. Janberdi al-Ghazali was a creature of the old world, a high-ranking Mamluk emir who had risen to become the powerful governor of Damascus, a city still nursing the wounds of Timur's sack a century earlier. He represented the last generation of an ancient warrior aristocracy, men whose identity was forged in the barracks of Cairo and the saddle of a warhorse. For decades, he served the fading Mamluk sultans with loyalty, administering Syria from the citadel of Damascus, a living link to the age of Baibars and Khalid. But the ground was shifting beneath his feet. To the north, a new and terrifying power was rising, the Ottoman Empire, armed with modern cannon and a disciplined army of janissaries. In 1516, the Ottoman Sultan Selim I, known as Selim the Grim, marched south to settle the ancient rivalry. The two empires met at Marj Dabik, north of Aleppo. The battle was a catastrophe for the Mamluks. Their heavy cavalry, the pride of centuries, was shredded by Ottoman artillery and gunfire. The Mamluk Sultan al-Ghawri died on the field and his army disintegrated. The news raced south to Damascus. Janberdi al-Ghazali now faced an impossible choice. He could attempt a doomed defense of the city with a shattered system, or he could negotiate with the conqueror. He chose survival. When Selim's victorious army approached Damascus, al-Ghazali did not resist. He opened the city's gates and surrendered, offering his allegiance to the new Ottoman master. For Selim, this was a perfect outcome. He needed a stable transition, a familiar face to govern this crucial province and reassure its population. He rewarded al-Ghazali's pragmatism by reinstalling him as the governor of Damascus, now as an Ottoman pasha. In a single move, the old Mamluk elite was absorbed into the new Ottoman order. For a few years, this arrangement seemed to work. Al-Ghazali ruled Damascus with his accustomed authority, but now his commands were issued in the name of the distant sultan in Constantinople. The delicate balance shattered when Selim the Grim died in 1520. His son, the young Suleiman, ascended the throne. Al-Ghazali, perhaps sensing uncertainty, perhaps dreaming of restoring a Mamluk kingdom with himself as sultan, saw his moment. He declared independence, striking coins in his own name and besieging the loyal Ottoman garrison in Damascus's citadel. It was a bold, desperate gamble, a ghost of the old Mamluk spirit trying to reassert itself. Suleiman the Magnificent, however, was not a ruler to tolerate rebellion. He dispatched a formidable army south. The confrontation was swift and decisive. Al-Ghazali's forces, lacking the Ottomans' centralized power and modern military, were crushed. He was killed in the fighting, his brief rebellion extinguished. His story is a poignant coda to 3 centuries of Saracen warriors. Janberdi al-Ghazali was not defeated by Crusaders or Mongols, but by the relentless tide of a new imperial age. His career, from Mamluk lord to Ottoman pasha to failed rebel, traces the exact line where the medieval world ended. He symbolizes the final transition, the moment the independent, cavalry-based warrior elite of the Islamic heartland was permanently absorbed into the bureaucratic, gunpowder empire of the Ottomans. The age of the castle and the lance was over, and the age of the cannon and the imperial decree had begun. The final rebellion of a Mamluk governor was extinguished by gunpowder, but the Ottoman rise was not only a story of land armies and cannon. True mastery of the new age required command of the sea, a domain where a different kind of warrior wrote his legacy in salt spray and shattered timbers. To understand the full scope of Saracen martial power, we must leave the deserts and castles behind and step onto the heaving deck of a war galley where the Ghazi spirit found a new home. This was the world of Kemal Reis, an Ottoman sea wolf whose name struck fear from the coasts of Spain to the harbors of Venice. He was not a sultan or a slave soldier, but a corsair admiral, a man who blurred the lines between private enterprise and imperial ambition, and in doing so, forged the first true Ottoman navy. His origins were rooted in the frontier ethos that had always driven expansion. Born around 1451, likely in the coastal region of Gallipoli, he came from a family of seafarers. From a young age, he learned the ways of the sea, not as a trader but as a Ghazi, a warrior for the faith, whose battlefield was the Mediterranean. He began as a privateer, commanding a small fleet under the patronage of local Ottoman governors, raiding Christian shipping and coastal villages. His success was immediate and spectacular. He captured ships laden with grain, weapons, and silks, but more importantly, he captured skilled sailors, shipwrights, and maps, bringing vital knowledge back to the Ottoman realm. His reputation grew so vast that he eventually entered the direct service of Sultan Bayezid II, who recognized that this corsair's brutal efficiency was the key to challenging the Christian naval powers that dominated the sea lanes. Kemal Reis was given resources and authority, transforming his private fleet into the core of an imperial navy. His greatest test came in 1499 at the Battle of Zonchio, also known as the Battle of Sapienza. The Republic of Venice, the undisputed queen of the Mediterranean, had sent a massive fleet to recover lost territories in the Peloponnese. The Ottoman fleet, under Kemal Reis' command, met them. What happened next was a revelation. While the Venetians relied on their traditional, heavy round ships, Kemal Reis employed a fleet of agile galleys, faster and more maneuverable. He did not seek a simple head-on collision. He used the wind and current to his advantage, isolating portions of the Venetian fleet and attacking with coordinated boarding actions. The battle raged for days, a chaotic melee of cannon fire, arrows, and grappling hooks. Though not a total annihilation, the Ottomans fought the Venetian navy to a bloody stalemate, preventing them from achieving their goals and proving, for the first time, that the Ottoman Empire could stand toe-to-toe with the greatest naval power in Christendom on the open sea. This was his true legacy. Beyond any single battle, Kemal Reis established the doctrines of Ottoman naval supremacy. He organized the fleet into a disciplined force, emphasized the construction of both galleys and the larger cannon-armed galleasses. He conducted daring raids as far as the Balearic Islands and the coast of Valencia, showing that no Christian shore was safe. He transported thousands of Muslim and Jewish refugees from the persecution of the Spanish Reconquista to the safety of Ottoman lands, a mission that blended piety with pragmatic population transfer. His career connected the land-based jihad of previous centuries to the vast blue frontier of the Mediterranean. He demonstrated that the warrior's courage was the same, whether on a horse or at the helm, and that control of the sea was just as critical as control of the mountain pass. When Kemal Reis died in a storm in 1511, he left behind more than a legend of plunder. He left a naval tradition, a school of seamanship and daring that would produce the next generation of Ottoman admirals. His work ensured that the struggle for the Mediterranean would continue for centuries, a permanent chessboard where the moves of a corsair from Gallipoli had forever changed the game. While Ottoman fleets ruled the waves, another warrior had forged his legend centuries earlier on the opposite shore of the Mediterranean, in a land of clashing faiths and shimmering palaces. Al-Mansur ibn Abi Amir, known to the terrified Christians of the north as Almanzor, was not a sultan by birth but a chamberlain who seized destiny with an iron grip. In the final decades of the glittering caliphate of Cordoba, he rose from the quiet halls of administration to become the most feared military force in all of Al-Andalus, the de facto ruler who held the true caliph as a pampered prisoner in his own palace. His power was built not on lineage but on a simple, brutal formula: relentless victory. For over 2 decades, he launched more than 50 major military expeditions against the Christian kingdoms of Leon, Castile, and Navarre, a campaign of annual devastation that became almost a grim seasonal ritual. Each spring, his armies would march north, a terrifying force composed of Arab cavalry, Andalusian infantry, and most tellingly, regiments of Berber warriors from North Africa and Slavic slave soldiers from Europe. This professional, multi-ethnic military, loyal directly to him, was a clear precursor to the Mamluk systems that would later dominate the East, a personal army that owed nothing to the old aristocracy. His strategy was one of shock and awe. He did not seek to conquer and hold territory permanently in the mountainous north. Instead, he aimed to cripple, to humiliate, and to drain the will to resist. He would strike deep into enemy land, burning crops, razing towns, and shattering armies before melting back to the south with his plunder. His most infamous achievement was not a battle, but a sacrilegious masterpiece of psychological warfare. In the year 997, he led a daring raid hundreds of miles into the heart of the Kingdom of Leon, targeting its spiritual core, the cathedral city of Santiago de Compostela. The shrine of St. James was Christianity's holiest site in Spain, a destination for pilgrims from across Europe. Almanzor's army sacked the city, but he left the apostles' tomb curiously undisturbed, a move some saw as calculated respect, others as a deeper insult. The true symbol of his triumph was what he took. He ordered the great bronze bells of the cathedral torn from their towers. Then, in a staggering act of symbolic inversion, he forced Christian captives to carry the heavy bells all the way back to Cordoba, over 400 miles. There, the bells were melted down and recast into lamps to illuminate the great mosque of Cordoba, the central jewel of Islamic Spain. The message was unmistakable. The voice of Christian worship had been silenced, captured, and transformed into a light for the faith of its conquerors. It was a propaganda victory that echoed for generations. In Christian chronicles, Almanzor became a figure of almost supernatural menace, the scourge of God. In Cordoba, he was the champion who had pushed the frontier further than ever before, the last great expander of Muslim power in Spain. He built a vast palace complex for himself outside the city, Madinat al-Zahra, as a monument to his authority, and he died in 992, undefeated on the battlefield, still on campaign. Yet his legacy was a paradox. The very system he built, reliant on expensive mercenaries and constant war, bankrupted the state and shattered the delicate social balance of Al-Andalus. His death plunged the caliphate into a civil war from which it never recovered, leading to its fragmentation into petty kingdoms. Almanzor had been the dazzling, destructive peak of a civilization, a warrior who held the future in his hand but through the sheer force of his ambition ultimately broke it into pieces. While Almanzor's victories broke the old order in Spain, the next great wave of resistance came not from the cities but from the mountains of North Africa. The Almohad movement was a puritanical Berber revolution, preaching a return to a strict unitary Islam, and its greatest military champion was Caliph Abu Yusuf Yaqub al-Mansur, whose very title meant the victorious. He inherited an empire that spanned from Morocco to southern Spain, but it was a realm constantly pressured by Christian kingdoms pushing south in the Reconquista and by internal rebellions. His first task was consolidation, a brutal, methodical campaign to crush dissent within his African domains, securing his base with an iron fist. This fierce internal discipline forged the army he would lead across the Strait of Gibraltar. His moment of destiny arrived in the summer of 1195. The ambitious King Alfonso VIII of Castile, sensing Almohad distraction in Africa, had broken a truce and besieged the fortress of Alacos. Yaqub al-Mansur crossed the sea with a massive force, a coalition of Berber cavalry, Andalusian volunteers, and African infantry. He found Alfonso's army camped on a plain near the castle, confident and eager for battle. The Castilian king, perhaps overestimating the power of his heavy knights, ordered a direct charge against the Almohad center. It was exactly what the caliph had hoped for. His center, composed of disciplined infantry, was ordered to hold firm, to absorb and blunt the shock of the famous Christian cavalry charge. As the knights became entangled in this resilient line, Yaqub al-Mansur unleashed his true weapon. On both flanks, his swift Berber horsemen swept around, executing a classic double envelopment. They surrounded the entire Castilian host, attacking from the sides and rear. The battle turned into a massacre. The Castilian army was annihilated, with chronicles claiming only a handful of knights escaped. King Alfonso himself barely fled, his royal standard captured. The victory at Alacos was a seismic event for the Iberian Peninsula. It shattered the military momentum of the Reconquista for a generation. Christian expansion was not just stopped, it was violently reversed. Yaqub al-Mansur followed his triumph by reclaiming vast territories, including the city of Trujillo, and his armies raided to the very gates of Toledo and Madrid. The psychological impact was profound, creating a deep fear of the Almohad military machine that would linger for decades. To commemorate his divine favor and power, the Caliph embarked on monumental building projects meant to outshine all others. In his capital of Marrakesh, he completed the Grand Qutubiyya Mosque, but his most audacious vision was in Rabat, where he began construction of what was intended to be the world's largest mosque. Its centerpiece was the Hassan Tower, a minaret of staggering scale that still dominates the skyline, though the mosque itself was never finished. His reign represents a fascinating parallel history. While Saladin was recapturing Jerusalem in the east, Yaqub al-Mansur was crushing the Castilian Crusade in the west. Both were leaders of powerful revivalist movements. Both delivered devastating defeats to Christian armies within a few years of each other, and both used victory to launch immense architectural statements of their faith and power. They were two halves of a broader story, proving that the medieval Christian drive for expansion faced a formidable, coordinated response across the entire Mediterranean, a reminder that the clash of faiths and empires was never confined to a single holy city. The legends of Al-Mansur and Yaqub al-Mansur were recorded by chroniclers who knew their names, but the final warrior on this list exists only in the shimmering borderland between history and story. He is the Saracen knight of European romance, a figure of chivalry and mystery who haunted the imaginations of the very people he was supposed to be fighting. In the epic poems and chivalric tales sung in the great halls of France and England, a curious character began to appear, the noble pagan warrior. He was not a monster or a demon, but a mirror to the Christian hero, possessing the same courage, loyalty, and martial skill. In the Song of Roland, written centuries after the battle it describes, we meet the Emir Balagant, a formidable and dignified opponent who commands respect even in defeat. In the Middle English romance The King of Tars, a sultan is portrayed as a powerful and ultimately redeemable figure, his story one of transformation through love and faith. These literary creations point to a fascinating truth: the enemy had been humanized, even romanticized. But where did this trope come from? Could there be a seed of historical reality behind the archetype? It is tempting to look for a single inspiration, a real warrior whose conduct was so exemplary it transcended the propaganda of holy war. Perhaps the memory of Saladin's mercy at Jerusalem, carefully documented and carried back by prisoners and diplomats, fed directly into this legend. Or maybe it was the lived experience of men like Fakhr ad-Din, the Ayyubid emir who jousted with Frankish knights and exchanged gifts, proving that the ideals of knighthood were not confined by religion. The chivalric Saracen may be a composite, a fictional patchwork stitched together from 1,000 fleeting moments of respect on the battlefield, of truces negotiated with mutual courtesy, and of the simple, grudging admiration one warrior can feel for another's skill. This cultural exchange created a hybrid ideal, a knight without a cross, whose virtue was inherent in his actions, not his baptism. The literary Green Knight of Muslim lore represents the ultimate mystery of this era, the way history is metabolized into myth. The real swords of Khalid ibn al-Walid and the real diplomacy of al-Adil were filtered through fear, wonder, and the need for a good story, emerging as something new, a legendary adversary who was worthy of the hero's steel. In a strange way, these fictional noble pagans are the greatest tribute of all, an admission from the medieval European mind that the warriors they faced across the sands of Palestine were not mere infidels, but equals in the only currency that truly mattered to a martial aristocracy: honor and valor. They became part of the enduring romance of the age, a testament to the power of human character to blur the lines between enemy and idol, transforming 30 prominent warriors into 30 timeless legends. And there we have them, 30 of the most prominent, fearsome, and fascinating Saracen warriors from the medieval world. From the sweeping conquests of Khalid ibn al-Walid to the chivalrous legend of Saladin, from the ruthless efficiency of Baibars to the shadowy masters of the assassins, their stories are a tapestry of courage, strategy, faith, and political intrigue. They were not mere antagonists in a Christian story, but complex figures defending their homelands, expanding their empires, and shaping the course of history in profound ways. Their legacies live on in castles, chronicles, and our collective imagination. If you enjoyed this deep dive into medieval mystery and martial history, be sure to like, subscribe, and hit the bell for more content. Who was your favorite warrior? Let us know in the comments.